Have you ever watched a parent give the exact same instruction to two children and get two completely different results? One child hears, "Put your shoes on," and 30 seconds later, they're standing at the door. The other child somehow ends up staring out a window, holding one shoe, thinking about dinosaurs, trains, clouds, or who knows what. 10 minutes later, everyone is frustrated. Now, here's the question most parents ask: why won't this child just listen? But what if that's the wrong question? Over the years, I've watched countless parents get trapped in a battle they never intended to fight. They try rewards, they try consequences, they try stricter rules, they try being more patient, and somehow the same struggles keep showing up. The truth is that some children aren't processing the world the way we expect them to. Their brains aren't following the parenting rulebook everyone else seems to be using. That's where neurodivergence enters the conversation. And once parents understand the difference between a child who won't do something and a child who genuinely struggles to do it, everything begins to change. Today, we're talking about neurodivergent kids, the behaviors that get misunderstood, the mistakes even good parents make, and the surprising things that actually help these children thrive. Because sometimes the child isn't the problem. Sometimes the map you're using simply doesn't match the terrain. For years, many parents have been told to focus on behavior. If a child isn't listening, correct the behavior. If a child isn't paying attention, correct the behavior. If a child is having emotional outbursts, correct the behavior. Simple enough, right? Well, not always. Imagine a mother standing in her kitchen after school. She's asking her 10-year-old son three simple things: put your lunchbox away, take off your shoes, start your homework. He says, okay. 5 minutes later, nothing has happened. 10 minutes later, he's sitting on the floor building something out of paper clips he found in a drawer. The mother feels her frustration rising. Did you not hear me? I did. Then why didn't you do it? And that's the moment where so many families get stuck. Because from the parent's perspective, the child heard the instruction and ignored it. From the child's perspective, something completely different happened. Many neurodivergent children struggle with what psychologists call executive functioning. Think of executive functioning as the brain's management system. It's responsible for planning, organizing, prioritizing, remembering instructions, starting tasks, and shifting attention between activities. When that system works differently, a child can genuinely want to complete a task and still struggle to begin it. To the outside world, it can look exactly like laziness, but the inside experience is often very different. It's like having a car with a perfectly working engine but a faulty transmission. The desire to move is there, the ability to move isn't always matching the intention. And that's one of the hardest things for parents to recognize, because effort isn't always visible. Then there's forgetfulness. A neurodivergent child might lose a water bottle on Monday, a sweater on Wednesday, and a homework folder on Friday. Parents often assume the child doesn't care. But many children care deeply. In fact, some care so much that they become anxious every time they leave the house because they're afraid they'll lose something again. What looks like carelessness can sometimes be a brain that struggles to track multiple pieces of information at once. Now let's talk about emotional outbursts. This is where misunderstandings become even more painful. Picture a child who seems perfectly fine during a shopping trip. Then suddenly, in the middle of a crowded store, everything falls apart. Crying, yelling, refusing to move. The parent is embarrassed, other shoppers are staring. Somebody nearby is probably thinking, that child needs discipline. But what nobody sees is everything that happened before that moment. The bright lights, the background music, the announcements over the loudspeaker, the crowded aisles, the strong smells, the constant movement. For some neurodivergent children, these experiences don't stay quietly in the background. Their brains may process them with much greater intensity. Imagine trying to solve a math problem while 10 televisions are playing different channels around you. Now imagine doing that for an hour. Eventually, something gives. This is where sensory overload enters the picture. And sensory overload often leads to what many specialists call a meltdown. A meltdown is different from a tantrum. A tantrum is usually aimed at achieving a goal, getting something wanted or avoiding something unwanted. A meltdown is often the result of overwhelm. The child isn't trying to control the situation. The child has lost control of their ability to manage the situation. That's a crucial distinction because the parenting response that works for one often makes the other worse. A child who is overwhelmed doesn't need a lecture about behavior in that moment. They need help regulating. They need safety. They need support. And then there are the children who confuse everyone because they can focus exceptionally well sometimes. One minute, they can't seem to complete a 5-minute chore. The next minute, they're spending 3 straight hours researching sharks, building elaborate creations, drawing, coding, reading, or talking about a favorite interest. Parents naturally ask, if you can focus on that, why can't you focus on your homework? It's a fair question. But neurodivergent attention isn't always about the ability to focus. It's often about the ability to direct focus where it's needed. And that's a very different challenge. Once parents begin seeing the hidden reasons behind these behaviors, something remarkable happens. The daily battles start making more sense. The frustration doesn't disappear overnight, but blame begins to fade. Because underneath many of the behaviors that adults find difficult, there's often a child working much harder than anyone realizes. And understanding that hidden struggle is where meaningful parenting begins. This is where things get uncomfortable for many well-meaning parents. Because once you start understanding neurodivergence, you also start realizing something else. A lot of the strategies you've been using were never actually designed for these kinds of brains. And yet, parents use them anyway, because they were told they should work. Let's start with something very common: raising your voice. A child doesn't respond the first time, so the parent repeats it louder, then louder again. Eventually, it becomes a full escalation. But here's the problem: volume doesn't create processing ability. If a child is struggling with executive functioning or sensory overload, louder instructions don't suddenly organize their thoughts. It just adds more stress to an already overloaded system. It's like trying to fix a slow computer by shouting at it. Another common pattern is repetition without adjustment. Go brush your teeth. Did you hear me? I said go brush your teeth. Same instruction, same format, same outcome expected. But a neurodivergent child may need the instruction broken down differently, visually, step by step, or even physically guided. Not because they're defiant, but because their brain processes instructions differently. Then there's one of the most emotionally loaded mistakes: comparison. Your sister can do it. Other kids your age don't behave like this. Why can't you just be like them? On the surface, it sounds like motivation. In reality, it often lands as shame. And shame doesn't organize behavior. It disrupts it further. It creates internal pressure without providing external tools. Now add something else that quietly builds over time: overload. Many neurodivergent children are placed into schedules that assume consistent stamina, consistent attention, and consistent emotional regulation. School, tutoring, extracurriculars, chores, social expectations, all stack together. From the outside, it looks like building discipline. But inside the child, it can feel like never having recovery time. And when there's no recovery time, small challenges start tipping into big reactions. One of the most misunderstood concepts here is masking. Masking is when a child learns to hide their struggles in certain environments, usually school or public settings, by copying expected behavior. So teachers may say, they're fine in class, but at home, the child completely unravels. And that confuses parents deeply. How can you behave all day at school but fall apart here? The answer is exhaustion. Holding it together in one environment often requires massive effort. Home becomes the place where that effort collapses. Not because the child is misbehaving, but because they finally feel safe enough to stop performing. And that performance recovery cycle is draining in a way many adults underestimate. Another mistake that often happens without ill intent is assuming motivation is the issue. When there's something they like, they can do it. So clearly they're just choosing not to try. But motivation and capacity are not the same system. A child might be highly motivated and still struggle to initiate or sustain tasks that require planning, sequencing, or emotional regulation. So, what looks like inconsistency is often a mismatch between demand and capacity. And here's the hardest truth for many parents to accept. If a strategy only works when a child is calm, regulated, and fully focused, it's not a reliable strategy for a child who frequently struggles with regulation. That doesn't mean structure is bad. It means structure has to be redesigned. Not removed, not loosened into chaos, but adapted to the child's actual cognitive profile. Because once you stop asking, why aren't they responding like other children? And start asking, what does their brain need in order to respond at all? You begin shifting from correction to support. And that shift changes everything about the relationship. Not instantly, but steadily, and in ways that often surprise even the most frustrated parents. Once parents move past blame and start looking at support, the first reaction is often hesitation, because support sounds soft, and many people worry that soft means no discipline, no structure, or lower expectations. But in practice, it's usually the opposite. Support is not the absence of structure. It's structure that actually matches how the child's brain works. Let's take something simple, getting ready for school. For a neurotypical child, a verbal instruction like go get dressed and pack your bag might be enough. For a neurodivergent child, that instruction can feel like being handed a full project plan with no checklist, no order, and no visible starting point. So instead of repeating the instruction, supportive parenting breaks it down into visible steps. Not in a complicated way, just in a way the brain can hold. One action at a time, one direction at a time. And suddenly, what looked like resistance starts to look like accessibility. Another powerful shift is visual structure. Many of these children respond better to what they can see than what they hear. A written routine on the wall, a checklist they can tick off, a visual timer showing how long remains before a transition. These are not babying tools. They are cognitive scaffolds. They reduce the mental load required to start and complete tasks. And when the mental load drops, cooperation increases naturally. Then there's sensory awareness. This is where parenting becomes less about control and more about observation. Some children are not being difficult when they refuse certain clothes. They are reacting to texture, tightness, seams, tags, or pressure in ways that feel overwhelming internally. Others may struggle in environments that adults consider normal: busy classrooms, loud gatherings, bright fluorescent lighting. To an adult, it's background noise. To some children, it's like multiple signals competing for attention at once, none of them turning off. So instead of asking, why are you acting like this? The more useful question becomes, what is your nervous system responding to right now? That one shift alone can prevent countless escalations. Now let's talk about emotional regulation. Many neurodivergent children don't struggle with emotions themselves, they struggle with regulating the speed and intensity of those emotions. So frustration doesn't rise gradually, it spikes. Disappointment doesn't stay contained, it spills quickly. Supportive parenting here looks like co-regulation first, meaning the adult provides calm structure before expecting the child to return to calm. Simple things matter more than people realize. Lowering voice tone, reducing verbal input, creating physical space, or just staying present without over-talking the moment. Because during overwhelm, language processing often drops significantly. And more words can actually make things worse. Then comes task design. Instead of long, abstract instructions like clean your room, the task becomes observable steps. Pick up clothes, put them in one place, clear the floor. One step leads into another without requiring constant decision-making. This is crucial because decision fatigue hits neurodivergent brains harder and faster. Every choice, what to do first, how to do it, where to start, adds cognitive load. Remove unnecessary choices, and performance often improves dramatically. Another important shift is reward framing, not in the sense of bribery, but in reinforcing effort loops. The goal is not perfect completion. The goal is successful initiation and task continuation. Because for many of these children, starting is the hardest part. Once they begin, momentum can carry them further than expected. And finally, something parents often underestimate: emotional safety. A child who expects constant correction begins to associate effort with criticism. A child who experiences guidance without humiliation begins to associate effort with safety. That difference shapes long term motivation far more than most discipline strategies ever will. So, what starts to emerge through all of this is a different kind of parenting logic. Less, how do I make them behave like everyone else? More, how do I design an environment where their brain can succeed? And when that question becomes the foundation, the home environment begins to shift, not into perfection, but into something more stable, more understandable, and far less combative than before. When parents finally step back and look at the bigger picture, something important becomes clear. A lot of the conflict was never really about bad behavior. It was about mismatch, a mismatch between expectation and ability, a mismatch between how a brain processes the world and how the world expects that brain to respond. And once that mismatch is understood, the entire emotional tone of parenting starts to change. The same child who once felt defiant begins to look overwhelmed instead. The same behaviors that once felt intentional start to look like signals of stress, overload, or difficulty organizing internal processes. This doesn't mean there are no boundaries. It doesn't mean children don't need guidance, consistency, or structure. They absolutely do. But the nature of that structure changes. It becomes less about forcing compliance in the moment and more about building systems that make success more repeatable over time. Small adjustments begin to matter more than big punishments. Clarity replaces volume, guidance replaces comparison, and support replaces constant correction. Over time, something subtle but powerful happens inside the home. The battles don't necessarily disappear overnight, but they reduce in intensity. Because the child is no longer constantly being measured against a standard that doesn't fit their cognitive wiring, and the parent is no longer constantly trying to force outcomes through strategies that were never designed for this kind of neurological profile. Instead, both sides begin to meet somewhere in the middle: understanding. And understanding changes the emotional climate of parenting more than anything else ever can. If there is one idea to take away from all of this, it is simple but deeply important. Children do well when they can. When they can't, it is rarely a lack of character. It is usually a lack of support, structure, or compatibility between expectation and capacity. And when parents shift from "why won't they" to "what do they need," everything starts to reorganize. Not perfectly, not instantly, but meaningfully. If this resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. I do read them, and I try to respond when I can. And if you want more honest conversations about parenting, adolescent psychology, and the realities behind child behavior that most people don't talk about, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful parenting tool is simply learning to see the child in front of you a little more clearly.